welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 6 disturbing stories from abandoned mines across North America. These are tales of people who descended into the darkness and found something waiting in the depths. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The Blackwater Mine sat about 40 miles northeast of where I grew up in West Virginia. My grandfather worked there in the 60s before it closed down in 71. He never talked about it much, which should have told me something. When he died, I inherited his property, including the old mining maps he'd kept in a metal lockbox under his workbench. I was 32 and going through what my ex-wife called a phase. I preferred thinking of it as finally having time to explore the places that shaped my family. The maps were detailed, too detailed actually. Someone had marked certain tunnels with red X's and written notes in the margins. Sealed 1969, do not enter, north shaft problems. I told myself the warnings were about structural instability. Mines collapse, everyone knows that. But something about the way my grandfather had pressed the pen into the paper, leaving deep grooves in the margins, made my stomach feel tight. I drove out there on a Tuesday in late October. Or maybe it was a Wednesday. I'd taken the whole week off work and the days were starting to blur. The access road was mostly grown over, branches scraping both sides of my truck. The main entrance had been sealed with concrete and a rusted chain-link fence, but I'd done my research. There was a secondary ventilation shaft about a quarter-mile east, and when I found it, the grate was already pried open. Someone else had been down there recently. Fresh scratches marked the metal where a crowbar had worked it loose. I brought 3 flashlights, spare batteries, rope, a helmet I'd bought at an army surplus store. The shaft dropped about 30 feet before opening into a horizontal tunnel. The air tasted like wet stone and something metallic, iron probably, or maybe just the smell of old tools and abandoned equipment. I kept my phone in my pocket, no signal down there anyway, and marked my path with orange chalk every 50 feet. The tunnel system was bigger than I'd expected. The maps showed maybe a dozen passages, but I kept finding branches that weren't marked. Side tunnels that led deeper into the mountain. Most were blocked with rubble or cave-ins, but some went on beyond where my flashlight beam could reach. I started to realize why grandfather had been so meticulous with his notes. You could get lost down here easy, real easy. About an hour in, I think it was an hour, my watch had stopped working. I found the first shrine. That's what I called it anyway. Didn't know what else to call it. Someone had arranged pieces of equipment in a small alcove carved into the tunnel wall. A mining helmet, a lunch pail, 3 pickaxes laid in a triangle. In the center sat a photograph, the edges curled with moisture. I picked it up. 5 men in mining gear, standing in front of a tunnel entrance. The photo was dated 1968 on the back in faded pencil. I recognized my grandfather immediately. Second from the left, younger than I'd ever known him, his face harder. The other 4 men had been scratched out, not torn or damaged by age, deliberately scratched with something sharp, their faces gouged away, leaving only rough paper fiber behind. I put the photo back exactly where I found it. My hands were shaking and I told myself it was just cold. The temperature had dropped since I'd entered. I could see my breath now, though it had been 60 degrees outside. Just the depth, I thought. Deeper underground, colder air. That's how it works. The tunnel ahead narrowed. I had to duck, then crouch, then finally crawl on my hands and knees through a section where the ceiling had partially collapsed. When I emerged on the other side, my helmet scraped rock, and I stood up in a chamber I didn't remember seeing on any of grandfather's maps. It was big, maybe 40 feet across, the ceiling lost in darkness above me. Support timbers ringed the walls, some collapsed, others standing at angles that seemed impossible. In the center of the chamber, someone had driven a mining stake into the ground. Tied to it with thin wire was a leather-work glove, just one. Positioned carefully, fingers spread like it was reaching for something. I approached slowly. The glove was old but not ancient. Leather still supple, not completely rotted. I bent down to look closer and noticed the wire. It was wound around each finger individually, holding them in that spread position. Someone had spent time on this, thought about it. That's when I heard the tapping, 3 slow knocks, metal on stone, coming from somewhere deeper in the chamber from one of the tunnels that branched off into darkness. I straightened up fast, my helmet light swinging across the walls. Nothing, just shadows and collapsed timber and the absolute silence of deep earth. I held my breath, listening, waited for it to come again. It didn't. I tried to rationalize it. Mines make noise. Settling rock, shifting timbers, water dripping through cracks. Old places creak and groan, but the sound had been too deliberate, too measured. 3 knocks evenly spaced like someone signaling. I decided to leave, not running, just a practical decision. I'd been down there long enough and the air was getting thin, or at least it felt that way. My chest was tight and I was breathing harder than I should have been. I turned back toward the crawl space I'd come through. That's when I saw the boot prints. They led from one of the far tunnels to the center of the chamber, stopping just behind where I'd been standing. Fresh prints in the dust, deep treads like work boots. Like someone had walked up behind me while I was looking at the glove and just stood there. But I'd heard nothing, no footsteps, no breathing, and the prints didn't continue. They just stopped, right behind where I'd been crouching. My throat went completely dry. I couldn't swallow, couldn't make myself turn around to check if someone was behind me now. Instead, I did something stupid. I looked up. The ceiling was closer than it should have been. I could see it now in my helmet light, maybe 12 feet up. Wooden support beams crossing at angles, thick with cobwebs and dust, and between 2 of the beams something pale was pressed against the rock. It took my brain a second to understand what I was seeing. A face, pressed into a gap between the support timbers, looking straight down at me. Skin the color of cave fish, lips pulled back from teeth that seemed too long, eyes that didn't blink in the beam of my light. The face was upside down, neck bent at an angle that would have snapped any normal person's spine. And then it smiled. Or its mouth stretched wider anyway. I couldn't tell the difference. I didn't remember running, don't remember the crawl space or the tunnels or how I found my way back. My next clear memory is sitting in my truck, hands bloody from scraping them on rock. My helmet cracked and missing my primary flashlight. The sun was setting. Hours had passed. My chalk marks were still on the tunnel walls behind me, but I'd apparently ignored all of them on the way out. I burned grandfather's maps that night. Didn't look at them again, just dumped them in a barrel and watched the paper curl and blacken. The lockbox is still in my garage, but I welded it shut. Last month, I got a letter from the county saying they were finally planning to seal all the remaining mine entrances permanently. They asked if I wanted to attend the ceremony, since grandfather had been such a long-term employee. I wrote back saying I'd be out of town, but sometimes, late at night, I think about that face pressed between the timbers. How it was positioned exactly above where someone would stand if they were looking at the glove. How patient it had been, how long it might have been watching before I looked up. And I wonder if my grandfather's 4 mining partners, the ones scratched out of that photograph, ever made it back to the surface. Story 2. My sister Angela got obsessed with urban exploration the summer after college. Abandoned hospitals, closed amusement parks, that sort of thing. I thought it was stupid, but she was my little sister, and she wasn't going alone if I had anything to say about it. That's how we ended up at the Copper Ridge mine in northern Montana, 3 hours from anything resembling civilization. The mine had operated from 1891 to 1952. Angela had found message boards where people talked about the place, how the tunnels went on for miles, how you could still find equipment and tools left behind. What she didn't mention until we were already parking at the trailhead was that the mine had a reputation. 7 miners had disappeared in 1949, not died in a collapse, disappeared. They went down for a shift and never came back out. The company had searched for 3 weeks before sealing off the deepest sections and eventually closing down the whole operation. "It's just a story," Angela said when I confronted her about it. "Every old mine has some tragedy attached to it. It's like how every Victorian house is supposedly haunted." I wasn't convinced, but we'd driven 6 hours to get there, and I wasn't about to waste the trip arguing in a parking lot. The entrance was a horizontal shaft driven straight into the mountainside. Someone had knocked down the warning signs years ago, and the chain across the opening was rusted through. Angela went first, her camera hanging around her neck, headlamp bouncing off the timber supports. I followed with our backpack of supplies, water, first aid kit, emergency flares, the kind of stuff Angela always forgot to bring. The air inside was surprisingly warm. Not hot exactly, but warmer than it should have been for being inside a mountain. And dry. My lips started cracking within the first 20 minutes. The main tunnel ran straight for maybe half a mile before branching into a maze of smaller passages. Angela had printed maps from the Historical Society, but they only covered the commercial sections. The deeper tunnels weren't documented. We found the first message about an hour in. Someone had written on the wall in chalk, "Stayd too long." Simple letters, surprisingly neat. Below it in different handwriting, "Hear them yet?" And below that in what looked like charcoal, "Don't listen." Angela photographed all of it while I stood watch, though I wasn't sure what I was watching for. The messages looked old but not ancient. Could have been written last year or last decade. Hard to tell in the constant darkness. "Probably kids trying to scare people," Angela said, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. We continued deeper. The tunnels had a strange quality to them. The sound of our footsteps seemed to travel too far, echoing back long after we'd stopped moving. And sometimes, I'd hear an echo that didn't quite match our rhythm. An extra footfall, slightly delayed, like someone was following us but not bothering to match our pace. The second message appeared 2 tunnels later, scratched into a wooden support beam. "They know you're here." I wanted to leave, told Angela we'd seen enough, but she'd found a side passage that looked promising, and once my sister got an idea in her head, there was no talking her out of it. The passage sloped downward, the ceiling getting lower until we were both hunched over. The walls were closer too, bare rock instead of timber, and I had to turn sideways in places to squeeze through. That's when we started hearing the knocking. Not loud, just a steady tap 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 somewhere ahead of us in the darkness. Metal on stone, rhythmic and deliberate. Angela stopped so suddenly I almost ran into her. "There's someone else down here," she whispered. "Or something's dripping," I said, but I didn't believe it. Dripping doesn't sound like that, doesn't have that much intention behind it. The knocking stopped. We stood frozen in the narrow passage, our headlamps creating shadows that seemed to move independently of the light. Then from somewhere behind us, back the way we'd come, we heard it again. Same rhythm, same deliberate pace, but now it was following us. "Okay," Angela said. "Okay, we can leave." We turned around, squeezing back through the narrow section, moving faster than was probably smart in an unstable mine. The knocking continued behind us, matching our pace. When we moved, it moved. When we stopped to catch our breath, it stopped too. We reached the main tunnel and Angela pulled out her map, trying to orient herself. But the map didn't make sense anymore. The tunnels we'd passed through didn't match the layout she'd marked. We'd somehow gotten turned around, or the tunnels had changed, or we'd taken a wrong turn we couldn't remember taking. "This isn't right," Angela kept saying. "This isn't right. We came from that direction, I know we did." That's when I noticed the smell. sulfur and something organic, like meat that had been left in a warm place too long. It came in waves strong enough to make my eyes water, and then we heard the voice. It was calling from one of the side tunnels, high-pitched and distorted but clear enough to understand. It was saying my name over and over. Marcus, Marcus, Marcus. The same voice my mother had used when she was frustrated with me as a kid. Same tone, same inflection. But my mother had been dead for 6 years. Angela grabbed my arm. "Don't," she said, "don't even look." But I couldn't help it. My head turned toward the sound almost involuntarily. The tunnel was narrow and dark, but something was standing just at the edge of my headlamp's reach. Pale and elongated, like someone had taken a person and stretched them vertically until their proportions were all wrong. Its mouth was moving, shaping my name, but the sound came from the wrong place. From deeper in the tunnel, or maybe from the walls themselves. I backed away, pulling Angela with me. We ran. I don't know how long we ran or how we found the exit. The tunnels seemed to shift around us, dead ends opening into passages we didn't remember, familiar landmarks appearing in the wrong order. But eventually, impossibly, we saw daylight, a gray square of evening light at the end of a tunnel, and we ran toward it like drowning people swimming for the surface. We made it to the truck and Angela drove. Neither of us spoke for the first hour. When we finally stopped at a gas station, I checked my phone. 7 hours had passed. We'd been underground for 7 hours, though it had felt like 90 minutes. Maybe 2 hours at most. Angela's camera was missing. We both remembered her having it in the tunnels, but neither of us could say when she'd lost it. It wasn't in the truck. Wasn't in our packs. Just gone. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived at my apartment. No return address, postmarked from Montana. Inside was a memory card, just a memory card, nothing else. I knew it was from Angela's camera before I even checked it. I almost threw it away without looking, almost, but curiosity won and I plugged it into my laptop. There were 97 photos. Most were what you'd expect, tunnel shots, rock formations, the messages on the walls, but the last 6 were different. They were taken in rapid succession, the time stamps showing only 3 seconds between each shot. They were all pointed back the way we'd come, down the tunnel behind us. In the first photo, the tunnel was empty. In the second, something pale was visible in the distance. By the 6th photo, it had crossed 300 feet of tunnel in less than 3 seconds. I could see its face clearly now, or what should have been its face. The mouth was there, stretched wide, but above it was just smooth skin. No eyes, no nose, just blank pale flesh pulled tight over bone. I deleted all the photos, destroyed the memory card, but I kept the envelope. Because written on it in handwriting I didn't recognize were 3 words. We stayed too. I haven't spoken to Angela about it. She moved to Seattle last year and stopped posting about urban exploration. Sometimes I get texts from her late at night, "Just you okay?" or "Can't sleep." I always text back. We both know what she's really asking. We both know what we heard down there calling our names. And we both know that in the 7th photo, the one I deleted immediately but can still see when I close my eyes, the thing had no legs. It had been pulling itself along the tunnel floor with arms that were far too long, fingers scraping rock. Coming closer with every frame. Story 3. I worked as a surveyor for the Forest Service for 6 years, which meant I spent a lot of time in places people had forgotten about. Old mining claims were common in the Sierra Nevadas, most of them abandoned since the early 1900s. My job was to document them, assess stability, recommend whether they should be sealed. It was solitary work, which suited me fine. I'd just gone through a divorce and wasn't much interested in being around people. The Greylock mine came up in my queue in September 2018. Small operation dug into a granite shelf about 8,000 feet up, accessible only by hiking trail. The file said it had been abandoned in 1903 with no recorded incidents. Clean closure, all workers released, standard decommissioning. Should have been a routine survey. The hike took me 4 hours. Fall colors were starting in the aspens, bright yellow against the pine green, and the weather was perfect. Cool but not cold, clear skies. I reached the mine entrance around 2 in the afternoon, set up my equipment, took preliminary photos. The entrance was small, maybe 6 feet high, shored up with squared timbers that had held up remarkably well. No warning signs, no chain, no indication anyone had been there in decades. I ate lunch sitting on a granite boulder, drinking coffee from my thermos, taking my time. There was no reason to rush. I wasn't expected back for 3 days, and this was only the first site on my route. After I finished eating, I packed up my lunch waste, leave no trace, and checked my gear. Helmet, light, backup flashlight, mapping tools, safety rope, chalk, everything I needed. The tunnel ran horizontal for about 80 feet before opening into a work chamber. They followed a quartz vein, extracting ore from a seam that ran vertically through the granite. The chamber was maybe 20 feet across, ceiling high enough that I could stand comfortably. Old equipment lay scattered around, rusted pickaxes, a broken ore cart, a pile of empty dynamite boxes soft with rot. What caught my attention was how clean everything was. No graffiti, no trash, no sign that anyone had been inside since it closed. Most abandoned mines get visited by adventurers, teenagers, curiosity seekers. But this one felt untouched, preserved, like a room that had been sealed and forgotten. I started my survey, measuring dimensions, checking timber stability, documenting hazards. The chamber had 3 tunnels leading deeper, north, east, and southeast. Standard practice was to mark the entrance and map at least the first 100 feet of each branch. I chose the north tunnel first, marking my path with chalk arrows pointing back to the main chamber. 30 feet in, I found the shoe. It was sitting in the middle of the tunnel, perfectly centered, laces tied in neat bows. A work boot, old-style leather, the kind miners would have worn in the early 1900s. But it wasn't covered in dust or cobwebs. It looked like someone had set it down yesterday, recently polished, placed deliberately. I photographed it but didn't touch it. Something about the placement felt wrong, too intentional. I marked it on my map and continued deeper. The tunnel ended in a collapse about 60 feet further in. Granite slabs had fallen from the ceiling, completely blocking the passage. I documented it and headed back to the main chamber. The shoe was still there, sitting in the same position. I walked past it quickly, not looking too closely at why the laces bothered me so much. They were tied in a bow, both boots, but if someone had left the boot behind, they would have pulled it off. The laces would be loose, not tied neatly, unless someone had placed it there, arranged it carefully. After the foot came out, I pushed the thought away and moved to the east tunnel. This one sloped downward at a steeper angle, the ceiling lowering until I had to duck. About 40 feet in, I found the second shoe. Same style, same position, perfectly centered in the tunnel, laces tied. My hands had started shaking by then, though I told myself it was just the cold. The temperature had dropped significantly the deeper I went. I could see my breath now, crystallizing in the beam of my helmet light. I took photos but didn't approach it, just documented its location and backed out of the tunnel. That left the southeast branch. Part of me wanted to skip it, mark it as inaccessible and leave. But that wasn't professional, and I wasn't about to let a couple of old boots scare me out of doing my job. So I checked my light, verified my chalk marks, and entered the third tunnel. This one was different. Wider, better supported, the floor smooth enough that it had probably been a main transit route. It curved gently downward, following some geological feature I couldn't see. After about 90 feet, it opened into another chamber, smaller than the first, but with a higher ceiling. My light couldn't find the top. In the center of the chamber was a wooden chair. It was old but intact, sitting on the bare rock floor facing the tunnel I'd just come from, as if someone had placed it there to wait, to watch. The wood was dark with age, the seat worn smooth, and on the seat, folded neatly, was a shirt. Flannel, red and black check, the kind miners wore. I approached slowly. The shirt looked decades old but remarkably preserved, no moths or rot. As I got closer, I noticed something else. Behind the chair, carved into the rock wall with something sharp, were words. 7 left, 6 stayed, 1 watching. The carving was deep, violent, the letters gouged into granite. Whoever had done this had spent hours chipping away rock in complete darkness. That's when my helmet light flickered. Not went out, just a brief flicker, like the battery had hiccuped. But in that fraction of a second of darkness, I heard movement, not footsteps, something dragging across stone, coming from the tunnel behind me. I spun around, my light stabbing into the darkness. The tunnel was empty, but I could still hear it. A slow scraping sound like fabric being pulled across rough rock. Getting closer, I ran. Didn't think about it, didn't plan a route, just ran back the way I'd come. The scraping sound followed, matching my pace. Every time I risked a glance back, the tunnel was empty, but the sound never stopped, never fell behind. It stayed exactly the same distance away, as if whatever was making it didn't need to speed up, knew exactly where I was going. I burst into the main chamber and kept running, heading for the entrance tunnel. Behind me, the scraping stopped. Silence rushed in to fill the space, so complete it made my ears ring. I didn't stop to investigate, didn't look back. Just ran until I saw daylight. I made it outside and didn't stop running until I was 50 feet from the entrance. Then I turned, gasping, hands on my knees, and looked back at the mine opening. Something pale was standing just inside the tunnel, just at the edge where sunlight couldn't reach. Tall and thin, arms hanging too long, skin the color of limestone. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. I backed away slowly. Didn't turn around until I reached the tree line. Then I hiked down that mountain faster than I've ever hiked in my life. My report said the mine was structurally unsound and recommended immediate sealing. I included none of the photos I'd taken of the shoes or the chair, just structural shots, documentation of the collapse, professional observations. They sealed it 3 weeks later, pouring concrete into the entrance, burying everything inside. But last month, I got a call from the Forest Service. They'd received a complaint from a hiker who'd heard sounds coming from underground near the Greylock mine site. Scraping sounds, rhythmic and persistent, like something moving back and forth behind the concrete seal. They asked if I'd be willing to go back up and investigate. I quit the next day. Because the night after I surveyed that mine, I'd unpacked my gear in my motel room and found something in my backpack that hadn't been there before. Tucked between my notebooks and water bottles, folded neatly, was a shirt. Red and black flannel, the kind miners used to wear. I burned it in the parking lot, but I kept the ashes. Because written in dust on the inside of my truck's windshield, written while I was sleeping, were the same words I'd seen carved in granite. 1 watching. Story 4. My cousin Sadie got a job cataloging archives for the Montana Historical Society the year after she finished her library science degree. Mostly it was boring stuff, old tax records, property deeds, that kind of thing. But one afternoon she called me, excited in a way I hadn't heard from her in years. She'd found something interesting. Personal journals from a mine foreman named Henrik Peterson, dated 1897 to 1901. He'd run operations at the Thornwood mine, which had closed under mysterious circumstances in 1901. Sadie knew I was into local history. I taught 9th grade social studies and thought I might want to see them. We met at a coffee shop near her office and she showed me copies she'd made. Peterson's handwriting was meticulous. His early entries were mundane, production numbers, payroll notes, weather observations. But in the summer of 1900, the tone shifted. He started documenting strange occurrences. Tools going missing and reappearing in impossible locations. Workers hearing their names called from empty tunnels. one entry from August 14, 1900 caught my attention. The men refused to work the lower galleries. They say something lives in the deep places, something that was here before we broke through. I do not believe in such superstitions, but production has fallen 40%, and I cannot force men into shafts they fear. Sadie watched me read, practically bouncing with excitement. So I looked up the mine's location. It's only about 2 hours from here, up in the Bitterroots. The entrance was sealed decades ago, but I found survey maps. There's a ventilation shaft about a mile south that might still be accessible. I should have said no. I had papers to grade, lesson plans to write, 100 better ways to spend a Saturday. But Sadie had that look in her eyes, the same look she'd had as a kid when she talked me into exploring the supposedly haunted barn on her parents' property. And I'd always been terrible at telling her no. We drove up on a Saturday morning in early October. The ventilation shaft was exactly where the survey maps indicated, hidden in a cluster of pine trees about 30 yards off an old logging road. The steel grate covering it had been forced open years ago, hinges rusted solid. The shaft dropped vertically about 25 feet before connecting to a horizontal tunnel. Sadie went down first, using a rope I'd brought. I followed, lowering our packs after us. The tunnel was narrow and low. We had to walk hunched over, but the timber supports were still solid. My back started aching after about 10 minutes. The tunnel connected to a larger passage that had to be part of the main mine system. Sadie pulled out a printout of the mine layout, trying to orient herself with her compass. The maps were incomplete, showing only the commercial operations, but she'd marked where Peterson's journal mentioned the lower galleries, a section that had been dug following a vein that descended at an unusual angle. We found it about 40 minutes later. A side tunnel that dropped steeply, the floor worn smooth like a slide. Wooden steps had been built into the rock at some point, but many were broken or missing. We descended carefully, testing each step before trusting it with our full weight. At the bottom, the tunnel leveled out and opened into a series of interconnected chambers. The geology was different here. The walls were darker, almost black, with veins of some mineral I didn't recognize running through them. The rock had an odd texture, almost organic, like the inside of something living. "This doesn't look like the same rock strata as the upper levels," Sadie said, running her hand along the wall. Her fingers came away black with dust. "They must have broken through into a completely different formation." That's when we found the offerings. That's the only word I have for them. Small arrangements of objects placed carefully in alcoves carved into the walls. A pile of nails arranged in a spiral, 3 buttons placed in a triangle, a section of chain coiled into a perfect circle. Each arrangement had a deliberate quality, like they were following rules we didn't understand, and they were recent, not from 1901. The metal was still bright in places, not completely oxidized. Someone had been down here within the last few years, creating these patterns. Sadie photographed everything while I stood watch, though I wasn't sure what I was watching for. The air down here was warmer than the upper tunnels, and it moved. Not wind exactly, but circulation, like the mine was breathing. I could feel it on my face, warm and humid, carrying a smell like wet earth and something else, something chemical. We continued deeper, following the chambers as they descended. Peterson's journal had mentioned the miners refusing to work here, claiming something lived in the deep places. I'd assumed it was typical superstition, miners spooked by darkness and isolation. But standing in those chambers, feeling the warm air move across my skin, I started to understand their fear. The chambers ended in a gallery that ran north-south, at least 100 feet long. The ceiling was high enough that our lights couldn't find it, and the walls were smooth, not from mining tools but from something else. Something that had worn the rock smooth over a very long time. In the center of the gallery was a hole, not a mine shaft, not a pit dug by workers. This was different. A circular opening maybe 6 feet across, edges smooth like a throat, descending into blackness beyond where our lights could reach. The rock around it was darker, discolored, and warm to the touch. Sadie approached it slowly, crouching at the edge, shining her light down. I watched from several feet back, my mouth dry, every instinct telling me to move away from that opening. "I can't see the bottom," Sadie said. "The light just stops, like it's being absorbed." That's when we heard the sound. It came from deep in the hole, not an echo, something moving, a wet sliding sound like something massive pulling itself up a smooth surface. And beneath that, a sound that might have been breathing, might have been speech. A rhythmic rasping that formed patterns almost like language. Sadie scrambled back from the edge. We stood frozen, listening as the sound continued, growing louder, growing closer. "We need to leave," I whispered. "Now." We backed away from the hole, moving toward the tunnel we'd come from. The sound followed us, though nothing emerged from the opening. Just that wet sliding, that rhythmic breathing speaking, echoing through the gallery. We ran through the chambers, past the offerings, up the steep tunnel with the broken steps. I fell twice, scraping my hands on rock, not caring about the pain, just needing to move, to get away from that sound. When we reached the vertical shaft, Sadie climbed first. I waited at the bottom, shining my light back the way we'd come. The tunnel was empty, but I could still hear it. Distant now but not gone, moving through the chambers below, searching. I hauled myself up the rope faster than I'd ever climbed anything. We emerged into afternoon sunlight that felt like a physical blow. We gathered our gear without speaking and walked back to the truck. It wasn't until we were on the highway, 20 miles from the mine, that Sadie spoke. "Did you feel it?" she asked. "When we were in that gallery, did you feel like something was watching us, like it knew we were there?" I had felt it, like eyes on the back of my neck, like attention from something vast and patient. That night I read the rest of Peterson's journal, the entries Sadie hadn't shown me. The last entry was dated November 3, 1901. "The mine is closed. We have sealed the lower galleries with concrete and timber. The men say it is not enough, that it has been waiting for centuries and will wait centuries more, that we merely woke it and it will not sleep again. I have purchased a train ticket east. I will not remain in this territory." The journal ended there. I looked up Peterson's name in historical records. He died in 1903 in Ohio, reportedly by suicide. The death certificate listed cause as drowning, though he was found in his locked room on the 3rd floor of a boarding house. The room had no water source. His lungs were full of something dark and mineral-rich, something the doctor had described as black earth. Sadie returned the journals to the archives. "We haven't talked about what we heard in that gallery. But last week, she called me late at night. She'd been doing research. The Thornwood mine had been dug on land purchased from the Salish tribe. According to tribal oral history, that location had been forbidden territory, a place where the earth had opened in the long ago time when the world was being formed, where something had come through from the deep places and never fully left. The tribal name for that location translates roughly to where it breathes. I haven't slept well since that trip. Sometimes late at night I hear that sound, that wet sliding, that rhythmic almost speech. It's not a dream, I'm wide awake, and it's not coming from outside, it's coming from below, from deep in the earth, rising through rock and clay and foundation until it fills my bedroom with that warm, humid air that smells like wet earth and chemicals. And sometimes, when I'm lying very still in the darkness, I feel it, a tension from something vast and patient, something that knows I came down into its territory, something that watched me run, something that's still watching. Story 5. I inherited my uncle's property in Nevada when he died in 2017. 300 acres of desert scrubland with a prefab house and a barn that was mostly collapsed. The will said he wanted me to have it because I'd been the only family member who'd visited him in the last decade. I'd driven out there twice, spent maybe 8 hours total with him before he passed. Felt guilty about it, honestly. The property came with mineral rights and an old claim on a silver mine that had operated in the 1880s. The mine entrance was about a mile north of the house, marked on the survey map my uncle had kept in a filing cabinet. He circled it in red and written in the margin, "Don't." Just that, don't. I should have listened. But I was 39, recently laid off from a tech job I'd hated, and feeling like I needed to do something with my life that felt real, physical. So I decided to explore the mine, document it, maybe see if there was anything salvageable. I drove out in March when the desert was actually bearable. The house was full of my uncle's stuff, old books, maps, notebooks full of observations about the property. One notebook caught my attention. It was recent, dated 2015, and it was all about the mine. Pages and pages of observations, measurements, theories, and warnings. Don't go deep. The main tunnel is stable, but don't follow it past the second support timber. That's where it changes. That's where you'll hear it. Hear what? He never specified. Just repeated variations of the same warning over 40 pages. Stay in the shallow section. Don't go deep. Don't listen if you hear something. Don't answer if it calls you. The mine entrance was larger than I expected, about 8 feet high, dug horizontally into a rocky hillside. The area around it was littered with debris from the mining operation, rusted equipment, broken timber, tailings piled in gray heaps. I set up a base camp about 50 yards from the entrance, pitched a tent even though the house was only a mile away. Something about sleeping near the mine felt important, like I needed to keep watch. The tunnel ran straight and level for about 200 feet. The timber supports were intact, the rock walls stable. My uncle's second support marker was obvious, a timber post painted with a white stripe. Beyond it, the tunnel continued into darkness. I could see at least another 100 feet before the curve hid the rest. I followed it. I don't know why. Curiosity maybe, or stubbornness. The sense that my uncle's warnings were just paranoia from too many years living alone in the desert. The tunnel descended gradually, following a mineral vein that left greenish streaks in the rock. After about 400 feet, it opened into a work chamber where they'd extracted ore. The chamber had 3 exits. The tunnel I'd come from, and 2 others that led deeper into the earth. That's where I heard the humming, not mechanical, not wind. A sound like human voices, multiple tones harmonizing, coming from one of the deeper tunnels. It rose and fell in patterns that almost made sense, like words in a language I didn't quite understand. I stood at the chamber entrance, listening. The humming continued for maybe 90 seconds, then stopped abruptly. Silence rushed in, and in that silence I heard something else. Footsteps. Multiple people walking, their steps synchronized perfectly. Coming from the left tunnel, moving toward the chamber. I turned off my light. Don't ask me why. Some instinct told me not to be visible. I pressed against the chamber wall and waited in absolute darkness. The footsteps continued, getting closer, accompanied by that humming again. The sound filled the chamber, resonating off the walls until I couldn't tell what direction it came from. Then they entered the chamber. I couldn't see them. It was too dark. But I heard them, maybe 6 or 7 people, judging by the footsteps. They moved across the chamber floor, their steps echoing in that perfect synchronization. The humming never stopped. If they were breathing, I couldn't hear it. Just the steps and the humming and the sound of fabric brushing against stone. They passed within feet of where I was standing. So close I should have been able to smell them, feel their body heat. But there was nothing. Just cold air and that unnatural harmony. They entered the tunnel I'd come from, heading toward the entrance. I waited until the sound faded completely before turning my light back on. The chamber was empty, but the floor was covered in footprints, dozens of them crisscrossing in patterns, some overlapping. They were all barefoot prints, men's and women's and children's feet, all walking together. But the impressions were shallow, barely pressed into the dust, as if whatever made them had no weight. I followed the prints back through the tunnel, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my flashlight. They led all the way to the entrance, then simply stopped. The last prints were right at the threshold where the tunnel met daylight. Beyond that, nothing. No prints in the dust outside, no trace that anyone had emerged. I should have left then, should have packed up and driven back to California. But the sun was setting and I'd already set up camp, and I told myself I was being irrational. Footprints didn't prove anything, could have been there for years. The humming could have been wind through the tunnels, acoustic tricks of the rock. I started a fire at my camp, cooked dinner, tried to read. But I kept thinking about those footprints, about the perfect synchronization of those steps, about how the humming had stopped the moment they reached the entrance, as if something wouldn't let them pass beyond that threshold. Night fell. The desert was clear, stars bright enough to cast shadows. I sat by my fire and tried not to look at the mine entrance, which was just visible as a darker patch against the hillside. Around midnight, the humming started again. It came from inside the mine, echoing out of the entrance, carrying across the desert. Multiple voices in harmony, rising and falling in those almost word patterns. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it at the entrance. They were standing just inside the tunnel. 6 figures backlit by some light source I couldn't see, creating silhouettes against the darkness. Adult-sized, standing perfectly still, and they were facing me. The humming continued, and as I watched, they began to walk forward in perfect synchronization. The same rhythmic steps I'd heard in the chamber, but they didn't emerge from the tunnel. They reached the threshold and simply stopped, stood there at the entrance, just inside where darkness met starlight, watching me. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me sitting by my fire, them standing at the entrance. Could have been 10 minutes, could have been an hour. Eventually they turned all at once, perfectly synchronized, and walked back into the darkness. The humming faded, silence returned. I didn't sleep that night, just sat by the fire, feeding it wood, watching the mine entrance. As the sun rose, I packed up my camp and carried everything back to the house. I didn't go back to the mine, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. I spent 3 days going through my uncle's notebooks looking for answers. He'd documented the humming, the footsteps, the figures at the entrance. He'd even tried to record them, but his tape recorders never captured anything but static. He'd researched the mine's history and found records from 1887, a cave-in that had killed 7 miners. Their bodies were never recovered. The company had hired a crew to dig them out, but after 3 days they'd stopped. The foreman's report was included in my uncle's notes. The men refused to continue. They say the collapsed miners are calling from behind the rubble. They say the voices are wrong, not asking for help, asking us to come through, asking us to join them. The mine was abandoned after that. The tunnel was left sealed until someone reopened it in the 1920s. By then, the collapse had somehow cleared itself. The tunnel was open, passable, empty. I sold the property 6 months later, didn't mention the mine in the listing. The new owners called me last fall, said they'd been hearing strange sounds at night, humming coming from somewhere on the property, asked if I knew anything about it. I told them I didn't, told them it was probably wind. Desert acoustics can be strange, but sometimes, late at night in my apartment in San Francisco, I hear it. That humming. Multiple voices in harmony, rising and falling in patterns that almost make sense. And I know that if I looked outside my window, I'd see them. 6 figures standing in perfect synchronization just at the edge of the streetlight's reach. Watching, waiting, humming. Story 6. The Silver Peak mine in Colorado had been closed since 1956, but the exploratory tunnels beneath it had never been properly mapped. That's what brought Dr. Elaine Thornberry and her graduate students up there in summer 2019. I was the safety coordinator they'd hired. My background in cave rescue made me useful for academic expeditions into unstable spaces. There were 5 of us total: Dr. Thornberry, 2 grad students named Jake and Priya, a mining engineer called Randall, and me. The goal was to map the unmapped sections and collect geological samples. Simple, straightforward work. We had permits, proper equipment, emergency protocols, everything by the book. The first 2 days went fine. We mapped the main commercial tunnels, which were extensive and well-preserved. On the 3rd day, Randall found what Dr. Thornberry had been hoping for, a small opening that led to the exploratory tunnels. Someone had sealed it with loose rock, but it wasn't difficult to clear. The exploratory tunnels were rougher, less developed. The miners had been chasing a vein that never panned out, digging in multiple directions before abandoning the effort. We split into 2 groups. Dr. Thornberry and Jake went north, while Priya, Randall, and I went east. Our tunnel descended at a steep angle, requiring rope work in several places. About 300 feet down, we found something that stopped Priya in her tracks. A chalk mark on the wall. Fresh chalk, bright white against dark stone. It was an arrow pointing back the way we'd come, and beneath it someone had written, "Last chance." "Who else knows about these tunnels?" Priya asked. "Nobody, according to our research. The access had been sealed for decades, and we hadn't seen any evidence of recent visitors in the main tunnels." We continued deeper, though I radioed our discovery to Dr. Thornberry. She said they'd found similar markings in the North Tunnel. Warnings, seemingly recent, in various places. "Turn back, it KNOWS. Don't wake IT." We should have listened. But academic curiosity is a powerful thing, and we'd come a long way for this research. We agreed to continue but maintain constant radio contact. Our tunnel opened into a natural cavern that the miners had broken into. It was massive, maybe 60 feet across, the ceiling lost in darkness above us. The rock here was different, sedimentary layers that predated the geological formations we'd been traveling through. The miners had broken through into something much older, and someone had been here before us. The cavern floor was covered in objects, hundreds of them arranged in circles that radiated from a central point. Mining tools, lanterns, boots, helmets, all laid out with meticulous care, following some pattern we couldn't understand. In the center of the circles was a wooden stake driven into the ground. Tied to it was a pocket watch hanging at eye level, still ticking. "That's impossible," Randall said. "No watch keeps time after 60 years underground." But it was ticking. We could all hear it, a loud, steady tick-tock that echoed through the cavern. Priya approached it slowly, her hand reaching out. I caught her wrist before she could touch it. "Don't," I said. "Something's wrong here." The radio crackled. Dr. Thornberry's voice, distorted and panicked. Get out now, there's something." Static drowned out the rest. I tried to respond, but the radio was dead. All 3 of our radios simultaneously stopped working. That's when we heard the scratching. It came from all around us, from the walls themselves. Thousands of small sounds like fingernails on stone coming from every direction. The circles of objects began to vibrate, tools rattling against the ground. The pocket watch swung wildly on its string, still ticking, the sound growing louder and faster. "Move," I said. We ran for the tunnel we'd come from. Behind us, the scratching intensified, and beneath it we heard something else. Breathing, or something like breathing. A wet, ragged sound that filled the cavern. Something moved in the darkness above us. I glimpsed it with my helmet light, pale and elongated, clinging to the ceiling with too many limbs, joints bending in directions that made my stomach turn. Its head was wrong, too flat, too wide, and when it opened its mouth, I saw rows of teeth that looked like they'd been filed to points. scrambled up the steep tunnel using the ropes we'd placed earlier. Behind us, that thing descended from the ceiling. I could hear it moving fast, its limbs scraping on rock. The sound of it was getting closer. Priya went first, then Randall. I was last, pulling myself up the rope as fast as my arms would allow. I didn't look back, couldn't. If I'd seen how close it was, I would have frozen. We emerged into the main tunnel system and ran. Didn't stop to orient ourselves, didn't check maps. Just ran toward what we hoped was the entrance. The scratching followed us, coming from the walls now, as if that thing was moving through the rock itself, keeping pace with us. We found Dr. Thornberry and Jake near the entrance to the exploratory tunnels. They were already moving fast, their faces pale. "Did you see it?" Dr. Thornberry gasped. "We saw it, all of us had seen it, and we kept running." We made it to the entrance tunnel to daylight and kept running for another 100 yards before stopping. When I finally looked back, the mine entrance was empty. No sound, no movement, just the dark opening in the hillside. We packed up camp that day, left half our equipment behind, didn't bother with proper documentation or samples, just got in our vehicles and drove. We didn't talk about it during the drive down the mountain, didn't discuss what we'd seen. Dr. Thornberry submitted a report recommending the exploratory tunnels be permanently sealed, citing structural instability. The university approved it without question. They poured concrete into the access point within a month, but the 5 of us know what's down there. What we woke up with our noise and our lights and our presence, and I know what I found when I unpacked my equipment back home. In my sample collection bag, which had been sealed in my backpack, I found a pocket watch. Brass, old-fashioned, tied with thin wire. It was ticking. The inscription on the back read, H. Morrison, 1955. I looked up the name. Harold Morrison had been a miner at Silver Peak. He disappeared in 1956, the year the mine closed, went down for a shift and never came back up. The company searched for 3 days before giving up. His body was never found. The watch is still ticking. I've kept it in a locked box in my garage, but I can still hear it at night. That steady tick-tock carrying through walls and floors. And sometimes, when it's very quiet, I hear the scratching too. Soft and persistent, coming from beneath my foundation. Like something is trying to dig its way up from the deep places, like it followed me home. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.